Hello, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences. I'm your moderator, Clara Davison. I'm an engagement officer in the College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you so much for joining us for book club. Today, we will discuss 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, selected because it was one of the most recommended titles by more than 100 Department of English alumni who shared their top 10 book lists earlier this year. So a huge thank you to our College of Arts and Sciences faculty, Catherine Borland, Director of the Center of Folklore Studies and an Associate Professor in the Department of Comparative Studies and affiliated faculty in the Department of English, and to Ana Puga, Associate Professor in the Department of Theater and in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese. We're grateful to both of them for sharing their expertise with us today. We are recording this webinar and we will share the recording with all of you in a follow-up email. Attendees know that you are muted and your video is off. If you have a comment or question to add to the conversation, you can share by typing or by speaking. So if you would like to type, click Q&A at the bottom of your screen and submit your comment or question. If you would like to speak, click raise hand at the bottom of your screen. I will enable your audio and call on you by name. A pop-up to unmute yourself will appear on your screen. You'll click OK to turn your microphone on, and then you can share your remark. That only turns on your microphone, not your video. So we already have about 30 folks on this webinar, so we will not be able to respond to every comment and question, but we will do our best to address as many as possible. If you need closed captioning for the event today, you can click live transcript at the bottom of your screen. So to get us started, Catherine and Ana will share some opening remarks about 100 Years of Solitude. After the remarks, we will open up the conversation. And today we'll begin with Ana.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that introduction. So in Spanish, this masterpiece of a novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez is titled Cien Años de Soledad. And in Spanish, soledad means both solitude and loneliness. So the book title could just as easily have been translated as 100 Years of Loneliness. Both solitude and loneliness are, of course, major themes in the work, and I'm looking forward to talking more with all of you about that. But first, I'd like to give you a little personal glimpse of how I came to this novel. I was 19 and a sophomore in college the first time I read the novel in January of 1980. I had read some short stories and a novella by Marquez called No One Writes to the Colonel, which, by the way, I highly recommend. No One Writes to the Colonel. And so I felt confident enough of my Spanish reading abilities to tackle the work that everyone seemed to be gushing about at the time. Also, I needed a long read for the plane ride between Chicago and San Francisco, where I was headed after dropping out of college to see the world and become a famous writer, a famous fiction writer, right? So Gabriel Garcia Marquez was like preparation, training. I had about $100 and a place to crash for a few days. And my plan was to approach a family friend who owned a bakery and to ask her if I could maybe just have a job in her bakery. And I thought that telephoning or writing ahead of time wasn't really necessary, that the way to approach this would be to just go and turn up on her doorstep and surprise her and ask her for a job. So when I got to the bakery one morning with 100 years of solitude / loneliness in my backpack, it turned out that the owner wasn't there. She wouldn't be in until the afternoon, I was told. There were a couple of tables in the sunny little storefront, so I decided to have a coffee and a pastry and wait for her. While I waited, I read for hours. The story struck me as rather strange and confusing. All the characters had similar names. I thought one of the first rules of fiction writing that even beginners like me knew was that you had to give your characters very different names because that way people would be able to tell them apart. And this guy was supposedly such a great writer, right? I was a little shocked by the theme of incest, but even at 19, I could relate well to the themes of loneliness, nostalgia, and memory. I didn't particularly identify with any of the characters, yet I still found them fascinating in their grandeur and exaggerated ways. Ursula reminded me a little of my mother, who I was certain would also live to be at least 100. Like my mother, Ursula was going blind and refused to acknowledge it. Like my mother, she was small and active, constantly cooking, cleaning, sewing, or organizing something. I recognized the Latin American universe of the play from what little I had traveled to Mexico to visit my Mexican grandparents, and what I had read of the United States policies in Central America. The banana plantation established by the North Americans in the novel was a fictional version of how the United States had actually set up shop in Nicaragua, Guatemala, and many other Latin American countries. The massacre at the banana plantation was the kind of injustice that I would read about in the newspapers in the late 70s and early 80s, the kind of massacre that took place in Mexico City in 1968, and later took place in various times and places in El Salvador and Honduras and Guatemala. The denial of the massacres and the refusal to acknowledge that workers exist and have needs continues to this day. Reading the massacre chapter at 19, I wondered, did this really happen in Colombia? It did. In 1928, when the Colombian military opened fire on striking workers of the United Fruit Company's plantation in Colombia, and not far from where Gabriel Garcia Marquez grew up. Was this how Latin America was built? By violent, ruthless men who fought endless, meaningless wars? I recall that the Mexican Revolution had lasted 10 years, killed 1 million people, and was ultimately betrayed by the one-party dictatorship of the PRI, cynically hailed by the United States as a democracy. I vaguely knew that Colombia had a very long, bloody conflict between the liberals and the conservatives, that there were dictatorships in Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, and that dictators like General Augusto Pinochet in Chile seemed to take great pride in their uniforms. A little like Arcadio, right, who designed his own uniform and loved issuing all those endless decrees. If only Pinochet's mom had told him to knock it off, like Ursula told Arcadio. Instead, Pinochet remained in power from 1973 until 1990. On the domestic front, I hoped I wouldn't end up like the spinster Amaranta, whose name in Spanish recalls the word amargada, or embittered. I was enthralled by the fantasy of a lover like Mauricio Babilonia, who would make yellow butterflies appear wherever he went. The rivalry between Amaranta and her sister Rebecca was far more intense than anything I had ever experienced in my petty competitions with my two sisters. In fact, it was the very intensity of emotions and sensual experiences lived by these characters that captivated me. What would it be like to live in sensual debauchery like Aureliano II? If I got the job in the bakery, maybe I could eat all the pastries I liked for free. That was my idea of sensual debauchery at the time. I wasn't finished with the novel when our family friend turned up in the late afternoon to close the bakery for the day. Wendy hugged me and greeted me warmly, but explained that her business operated on such a tight margin that she couldn't possibly afford another employee. I stayed in San Francisco a few more days and spent much of that time walking around the city and reading in cafes, the only tourist activities my limited budget allowed for. The following week, I flew home to Chicago and registered for the spring quarters classes. 10 years later, I was a 29-year-old journalist, coincidentally Garcia Marquez's vocation, working as the Latin America correspondent for the Houston Chronicle, when I was sent to Cuba to write about the fate of the island after the Soviet Union began to withdraw its economic support. On the flight from Mexico City to Havana, I noticed a middle-aged man sitting alone in first class. He looked a lot like the photos on the back covers of all the Garcia Marquez novels I had read. Could it be the famous author himself? Should I ask him? I stared at him as I got up and used the bathroom in first class so that I could sneak another look at him. He looked back at me and smiled. Should I speak to him? What would I say? Maybe I should respect his privacy. It probably wasn't him, and I would just make a fool out of myself and feel silly. I went back to my seat in the coach. When I got to the airport in Havana, I realized that there was a state motorcade there to meet the man. Later, I read in the newspapers that Garcia Marquez was in Havana to visit his friend Fidel Castro and attend the annual film festival. As I reread this novel last week at age 59, as one might expect, I was more focused on the themes of life, work, mortality, and regret. I was struck by how both Amaranta and Colonel Aureliano Buendia undo their work so that they can do it all over again the next day. Amaranta recalls Penelope, the faithful wife of Odysseus who fended off suitors in his absence, by saying she would marry him just as soon as she finished, or marry one of them as soon as she finished weaving that funeral shroud she was working on. It pained me to reflect on how the aging colonel feels inspired to try to get in the war game one last time, tempted yet again to use violence to try to right the world's wrongs. I was saddened by the themes of remembering and forgetting, because I know that Garcia Marquez suffered from memory loss at the end of his life and was only able to complete one of the 3 volumes he had planned for his autobiography before his death in 2014. I highly recommend the first volume, which I have here, and it only takes you through his first job as a journalist, and yet it weighs in at 579 pages. Thank you.
Okay. So can you hear me? Is it good? Yeah. Okay. Katie here, and I'm just going to follow up a little more informally to Anna's remarks and start myself with my first encounter with 100 Years of Solitude, which was actually at the same university that Anna was at in Chicago a few years earlier, in actually Spanish language in translation, literature in translation class, which focused on the Latin American boom writers. So Garcia Marquez, Mario Vargas Llosa, Julio Cortázar, and who's the Mexican, Fuentes. And I remember I was a young feminist at the time, and I remember challenging my professor with the fact that we were reading only male authors. And so he threw in this book called Domitila, which was the autobiography of the wife of a tin miner in Bolivia. So there was, you couldn't imagine a greater contrast between these very experimental works of fiction and sort of true to life, realistic autobiography of a laboring woman. Nevertheless, years later, I encountered Isabel Allende's House of the Spirits and Rosario Ferre's House on the Lagoon, which both borrow heavily from Garcia Marquez in terms of setting up the stories as a family saga that also works as a kind of history of the politics of their countries, which in this case would be Argentina and I'm sorry, Chile and Puerto Rico. So, so yeah, so I did get the female versions of these kinds of very experimental fiction a little later on, as many of us did. I think the first boom was, it was male writers who were doing really fascinating things from a particular perspective that we now think of as maybe partial. So anyway, back then, those boom writers introduced me to Latin America. So I had no personal experience. I knew very little about that area of the world. I knew very little about anything outside of the United States. I hadn't traveled yet. And so when I did have the opportunity to go to Costa Rica to train for the Peace Corps, I actually, I think the 100 Years of Solitude was kind of a lens through which I understood the landscape and the people that I encountered there. So I distinctly remember being on a train, which probably doesn't exist anymore, that went from the capital, San Jose, to Puerto Limon, which is on the Caribbean side of the country, and going up over these very steep, green, lush mountains and down into banana plantations and fields, and seeing through the window of the smoky train, little houses with, maybe a woman in an apron with 2 or 3 kids kind of gathered around her, all waving at us from their front porch, in the middle of this vast solitude. And I thought, oh, it's just like Macondo. And probably erroneously, but certainly the romance of my experience was helped along by these prior images that Garcia Marquez had provided. And I think that too is probably common to many English translation readers at that time. It was an introduction for us to these worlds that we really knew very little about. And I think what captivated me most about 100 Years of Solitude and other works by Garcia Marquez was the sort of tongue-in-cheek character of the narrator. So with everything that he says, everything that the narrator kind of provides for us, he immediately undercuts. And it's all told with this kind of generous humor, with great, as Anna said, exaggeration, and peppered with all sorts of folk motifs and mythical allusions. So we're not just reading a text that has episodes from Latin American political history in it, although it certainly has that, but we're also looking at the creation of the world, right? The conquest, the striving for perfection that Jose Arcadio is an emblem of in all of his desires to create his utopia out there, where no one had invited him to come. So I think that part of the novel, that way in which it resonates with other literary motifs and mythical allusions, is part of what gives it its value. It's why we get enraptured by the story, even when it's quite difficult to follow. And I think maybe I would start my kind of questions to the group here with that question of, why do you think that Garcia Marquez makes it so difficult for his reader to keep track of the basic timetable of the narrative? What is that doing in terms of our reading experience, besides frustrating us?
All right, well, thank you, Anna and Catherine, for your opening remarks. To all of our attendees, feel free to click raise hand if you'd like to share a remark by speaking. I will just unmute you. Your video won't be turned on. If you would like to type, you can use the Q&A feature to type in any comments or questions throughout the event. So Catherine and Anna, the first question we have from Susan, and she also has a comment to your question, Catherine. Susan says, perhaps he thinks that there is no progress over time in history. Is that why he plays with the timeline? Mm-hmm. So, great comment from Susan. And her question was, what do you think we missed in the translation that we would have perceived in the original Spanish?
Well, that's probably a question for Anna.
Well, it's Spanish. I don't. It's pronounced differently. It has a different feeling. somehow. It's hard to say. And I translate myself. I've translated plays from Spanish to English. And yeah, it's difficult to specify. And many people tend to romanticize the sound of Spanish. They go on, and, you know, there's some old country song about how Spanish is a loving tongue and all that. And I don't really buy that necessarily. But it has crisper vowels, like it's consonant, vowel. And so when you pronounce it in your head, for example, a name like Aureliano, which is repeated hundreds of times in the novel, the A and the U are separate. It's Aureliano, right? It's not Aureliano, or however you would say it in English. And I think that detail, just those sorts of details, right? Thousands of them added up, create, for me, somehow a crisper experience orally, like AU orally. Other than that, there's not, I mean, I think the translation, this time I read parts in English and parts in Spanish and compared them. I was actually looking at the translation, and I think it does a really good job of capturing the rhythm, the sentence lengths, that kind of piling on of detail in these really long sentences. And then punctuating those with sort of short jab sentences that are sometimes are like the punchline of a joke or something. And I only found one thing that I thought was actually a mistake, where there's a false cognate in there, because there's the word compromiso in Spanish does not mean compromise in English. It means commitment in English. And the Gregory Rabassa, the translator, who I think is a great translator, just slipped and translated it as compromise instead of commitment. But other than that, I think it's fine in English.
Sean wrote, Cien Años inspired my current research, which looks at temporal structures / relationships and narrative. So one thing to consider is that the novel's timeline roughly approximates a sinusoidal wave superimposed across a straight line. And he adds, so there's an element of progression combined with an element of circularity.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and there are several points in the novel where one of the characters will actually say that they recognize that time has stopped or time is repeating itself, right? So it's not just the confusion created by the repetition of the names Aureliano, Aureliano Segundo, Aureliano, and the Jose Arcadio, the same thing. But it's also these, you know, this kind of, the characters themselves are seeing time as something that moves around in eddies and kind of gets stuck in certain places. And then of course the whole idea of the novel or the world that the novel has constructed kind of being swept away by the winds at the very end is a kind of erasure of what has come before, right? So an obliteration of the imaginary.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting the way everything is foreshadowed, and he repeats a few times how the last thought he had as he stood before the firing squad was blah, blah, blah. Or at the end, how Aureliano, the last Aureliano, sits in the room and reads in the parchment of Melquiades that everything has been fated and foreseen by Melquiades. And so he keeps reading to find out what's going to happen to him. And then it happens, and that's over.
Right, like, so his reading and the occurrences are kind of coming to a point in which they overlap and boom, everything disappears. Um, so it's quite, yeah, it's quite magical.
And cruel too, because his offspring is being eaten by
Like ants.
ants, and his wife has just died in childbirth, and he doesn't seem too preoccupied with any of that. He's just looking through the parchments again and try to figure out what's going on.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's also, I mean, the whole repetition of the revolts. So going off to war happens, as Anna said, in the summary statement, it happens 32 times, right? Or 33 times. But we then get the the hero coming home and deciding not to fight anymore, and then something happens and off he goes again. And what I noticed this time was that each time he goes off, he takes a different group of people with him. So it's a kind of repetition with variation. So the first time he goes, it's with the founders of Macondo, who are his little troop of merry men. And the second time, it's with the firing squad that's supposed to have killed him. And then the third time, he's gone off and he's coming back with this 2,000 Indians who are led by a very ferocious visionary indigenous person. So yeah. So I mean, I think that, like, so the repetitions are everywhere in this novel.
And I think the fourth time maybe he wants to go with some of his sons, some of the 17 Aurelianos, because they come to town and they get him all worked up again.
And there are also these wonderful, like, little details. This doesn't really have to do with time, but little details where, because this reminded me, because you mentioned the Aurelianos, that they were all supposed to have been killed in the same week, but there's one who escaped, right? So we get the one version, and then later on we learn, no, there's one that survived and ends up being killed, I don't know, 20 years later, as soon as he gets to Macondo, because his relatives won't let him in the house. And when Jose Arcadio Segundo has this delirium about the 3,000 workers who have been massacred, apparently he's the only one, except there is this child that is mentioned who was on his shoulders when the whole thing went down. So we have this idea that the narrator doesn't always keep track of his own facts, right? There's a character that slips out and has a different destiny.
Are there more questions, Clara?
There are no more questions right now, so attendees, please do continue to share in your comments and questions. One question that was submitted in advance by someone who teaches AP literature to 12th graders was wondering how both of you teach this novel and how she should sort of frame it for her students.
Frame it, wow. For 12th graders. I would say, that maybe 12th graders would be more open in some ways than older people to a world, to this thing that's been labeled magical realism, to this style, where, because there is a lot of fantasy and anime, and there's a lot of popular culture in which has kind of drawn from this tradition, right? That they've already been exposed to. And yet there might be some people who are expecting more of a straightforward, realistic kind of read. I've never taught the novel myself. I've taught another Marquez novel at Ohio State called Chronicle of a Death Foretold, which is much more kind of journalistic. Though it has its odd things happening as well. Yeah, I would think it's a big novel, so it would take quite a while for students to finish it, right? So it would be something that you would read, I guess, over the course of a semester or over the course of a year, a whole school year. And if it's read in digestible little chunks, right, then you can talk about all of the various issues. I mean, you could separate out what's the politics. You could have a unit or a semester on politics in Latin America, or even politics around the world, because these sorts of things like violence, corruption, dictatorship, they don't just happen in Latin America, they happen all over the world, right? So that could be one unit, and then you could have maybe another unit on the more private space and the emotional issues and the love and the lust and the incest. And then I don't know if you would have parents who complain that why are their children reading about incest? Because that sort of thing has happened to me with other works where there's explicit sex, you know, and parents will say, why are you giving my child pornography to read? And I have to explain that it's not pornography, it's art, it's great literature. And sometimes they buy it and sometimes they don't. And then I have to assign an alternate reading.
Yeah, I would say the one thing that probably for 12th graders, probably for anyone, that would be, and I know I've had this difficulty teaching Salman Rushdie too, that the writing style is so full of detail that it's very hard to keep track of everything. So providing some kind of crib sheet for a student reader so that they don't have to, they can read without having to worry about keeping track, like perhaps I don't know, maybe it's hard to say, the various thematic things that are happening in each chapter, for example. Like, I think that might be a useful tool for a reader who's just coming to something like this for the first time. And again, I know this because having taught Rushdie, the students just get frustrated because they can't keep everything straight. It's too much. And talking perhaps about, well, can you just relax and enjoy and let it wash over you, you know, without worrying about keeping every little factoid in your head, because the author is obviously overloading you. So the point is not to try to keep it all straight. The point is to jump in and swim in it, right? I don't know if that's helpful, but that's what I would do.
I always find it an exercise that works well with students is to say, okay, so just, you know, close the book, take out a sheet of paper and free write. This isn't for a grade or anything. What image remained with you from this book? Is there any image that comes to mind? And can you just write it down and describe it? And then I use their descriptions as the starting point for discussion. Sometimes that works. Like for me, the yellow butterflies really stuck in my head. And almost every time I see a yellow butterfly in my whole life, I always think, Mauricio Babilonia.
Well, and it's also the yellow butterflies in a bathroom that's crawling with scorpions. So you've got butterflies and scorpions in the same image, which I think is great. And also the repetition, because if you remember when Jose Arcadio Buendia, the patriarch, dies,
Mm.
it rains yellow flowers for like days, and they have to get shovels to shovel the flowers off the street so they can get him to the cemetery. So there's a way in which there's a kind of resonance going on between those outrageous magical realist, kinds of what descriptive elements.
Yeah, there are really beautiful images, and then there are really super grotesque images too.
Mhm.
Right? Images maybe we don't necessarily want to remember. Were you going to say something, Clara?
Hi, Susan had a comment to add to this conversation that she read the Wikipedia article about the book after reading the book. And I did not try very hard to keep track of the characters, but I think I got some appreciation of the images. Maybe I would have understood more if I had read the wiki first to use as a crib sheet.
Mhm.
Oh, can I ask Susan if she has any favorite, or our audience in general, if they have any favorite? I'm going to try my tried and true conversation starter from my classes. Do they have any images that stuck with them or that repulsed them or that they loved?
And while they're thinking, I'll tell you one of mine.
Okay.
So when the soldiers come and they kill the woman who's been bitten by a rabid dog in front of her parents.
Mm.
Yeah, that was just like, ew, how horrible.
Yeah.
And there's a couple, there are scenes of great violence in the novel, but they're told in such a matter-of-fact way. I mean, it's not like, the getting into the violence in that kind of pornographic way. That's not what he's doing. He's just throwing it in there along with the rest of the story. And so you come up against those things and kind of, or at least my experience is, you kind of gasp and they're taken aback. But then the next thing is this lovely image of, I don't know, lovely. The image of the blood from Jose Arcadio, who is mysteriously killed with no wound, but the smell of gunpowder, and how the blood goes to find Ursula in her home, and then she can track back to the body. That was pretty interesting too.
Yeah. Yeah, along those lines, like less graphic, but just as powerful in its way is when the 17 Aurelianos go to Ash Wednesday Mass, and the priest puts the cross with the ash on their forehead, and then they can't rub it off. And it becomes the target for the people who are hunting them down and assassinating them one by one.
And at the same time, Aureliano asks his doctor to paint a circle on his chest where his heart is. But when he shoots himself, the doctor has painted it in such a way that he doesn't damage any vital organs, right? So you have these motifs that then get flipped in these very interesting ways all the way through the novel. And so those would be fun to explore, I think, with students, like, how many of these can we find that are like reversed later on? So.
Yeah, or return to with, like you said, with a repetition, but a revision as well.
So we have a couple of questions about politics in the novel. So Darlene asked, although the novel deals with political and historical issues, such as the massacre of strikers, to what extent do you think that this is a political novel? And Susan wondered about the descriptions of the revolutions and how they eventually resolved. I wondered to what extent this parodied the history of South America.
Yeah,
think it definitely does. Yeah.
go
But
ahead.
it's not, go ahead, Anna.
No, you go ahead.
Well, but it's not, I don't think he's, so it's not like if you compared it with something like House on the Lagoon or House of the Spirits, it's not specific to specific, military operations or anything like that. It's a more broad stroke kind of critique of the endless wars of the 19th century, and the ways in which rebellions start and peter out, and then then they start up again because the basic problems haven't been resolved, right? There hasn't really been any kind of addressing of the underlying issues. So that's what I would say. Anna, take it from there.
Yeah, I agree. With one exception, that the massacre was an incident that happened that Gabriel Garcia Marquez had heard about because it was near where he grew up. And I think in some interview I read, he said that it wasn't actually 3,000 people, that he had inflated the number. Nobody knew exactly what the right number was, but 3,000 seemed like a good number to him, something like that.
But that also reflects too the way in which that can work as a kind of critique of the Pinochet era, when there were thousands of people being dumped in the sea.
Sure.
So
yeah, in Argentina, where like more than 30,000 were disappeared. There's also something Holocaust-like about the trains, in a lot of massacre accounts I've read, and I've read too many massacre accounts, there's often one person who survives, right? One witness. And as you said, in this case, there were two witnesses. But that's like a trope or something from accounts of massacres, that someone will play dead, for example, and then survive to be able to tell what happened. That happened with the massacre of 72 migrants in northern Mexico just a few years ago, where one young man from Ecuador survived and was able to relate what had happened to the whole group. Or Ayotzinapa, the 43 disappeared students in Mexico just a few years ago. Also, there was some survivor witness. The other thing that I think is very classically Latin American that he pokes a lot of fun at is kind of the way in which power corrupts people. And people go in with all of these ideals, and then they become monsters, which, as I said in my opening remarks, is not just Mexico. It's a lot of places around the world, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think it's 100% a political novel, but it's also got all this other stuff.
Mm-hmm. I've always wondered with Gabriel Garcia Marquez how his sort of day job as a journalist influences his work, and just especially in this novel that is so straightforward about such fantastical elements. I don't know if either of you have thoughts.
I think he writes really clearly, in spite of, I can see how it's difficult work in some ways, but he has that kind of journalistic simplicity in some ways too, I think. He's not like a James Joyce writing Ulysses, where you've got some stream of consciousness and the invention of a new language, and you don't really understand, what's being said here, right? If you read closely and you look up the vocabulary words you don't know, it's all very simple, really.
Mm-hmm. And so in that vein, could you talk more about the influence of folklore and all this mythology and religious reference that's all packed in here together.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that that can also be seen as a kind of parody or critique of the church, right? Particularly the religious stuff, and particularly with Fernanda and, you know, this horrible um, closed up castle that she lives in somewhere in the cold northern, you know, parts of Colombia. There's probably some kind of regional critique there going on as well, but
The Highlands, right?
the Highlands, who are all straight-laced and stuck up. So there's that. And then, you know, like when Remedios the Beauty levitates with the bed sheets. So she never actually dies. She just ascends into heaven. And that's a direct reference to the Virgin of the Assumption, right? She does levitate into heaven. So it's a religious image that has been made more ordinary and mundane by the fact that, you know, it's the bed sheets that she's trying to fold in the wind that take her away. So there's that. And there's just, just all through the novel, these references to, for instance, the man whose left arm was shriveled because he raised it against his mother, right? Or the woman
That was hilarious.
because something, right? So like these outrageous punishments for moral transgressions, which I think are, you know, we're supposed to think of them as ludicrous, right?
Well, but my mother used to say to me, if you stick your tongue out like that at me, your face is going to freeze that way. God is going to make your face freeze that way.
Yeah.
And
there is also, I mean, I know from my experience living in Nicaragua, you know, in more rural peasant type communities, people do have, like, they do cite these supernatural creatures, and they catch the woman who's transformed herself into a monkey, and they tie her to a tree, you know, to punish her. They do these things, and it's part of life, right? So it sounds very magical realist to us when the beast that was kind of half man and half animal, I think it's like a bull or something like that, they find him and they find that he's got wings that have been chopped off, and then they string him up in a tree. Like it's hard to say whether that is based on something that might have happened or not, because in small communities like Macondo, people do have these beliefs, right? So they recognize monsters as part of the reality of where they are.
I also think it's something very Genesis-like to it, right? It's the beginning of the family, and so begat so-and-so begat so-and-so. And they were innocent at first, and no one had ever died in the town. And then they become less and less innocent as time goes by. And they're not really expelled. Well, some of them are exiled off to Europe, right? But there are all these, like, there are biblical proportions to things like the rain for 4 years, or the ants that eat everything, including the baby, or the, what other plagues are there?
Insomnia plague.
The insomnia plague, nobody can sleep and they forget everything. And the birds all die for a while. There's a scene in which a bunch of birds smash against a screen or something, and the place is littered with birds. And then at the end, I guess it's a hurricane, right, that comes and destroys everything. And you don't know whether there's going to be another Genesis, Or is this the end forever and ever?
Yeah, well, what it says in the text is that people have been dreaming of a city of glass or city of glass houses with no buendias. So the idea is like something is going to merge on that spot, but the people who exist in it right now will not be there, right? And I don't know, I always thought the glass houses might have been a reference to you know, sort of modernist architecture or something, you know, some other era that doesn't exist yet in this novel. Because there is also, I think, a critique of progress in the novel. The idea that science and invention is going to create the utopia. So like the idea, like the very first sentence with the, we went to see ice, and you're like, okay, ice, you know, ice is the magical thing.
Right.
So
Right, we went to see ice, and then the first Buendia is all obsessed with, Jose Arcadia, with taking Ursula's gold coins and trying to shape them into something else, and he ends up just destroying it all and having like a burnt pot with some charcoal in there. So they're all engatusados would be the word in Spanish, like wrapped up in this dream of, mesmerized by this idea that science will lead the way to progress, and they're going to bring the railroad to town and everything is going to get better. And instead there's a massacre and the railroad takes all the dead bodies out of town, right?
So one thing we haven't discussed yet is the election in the novel, and in the spirit of election day yesterday, I figured I'd bring that up.
yeah, good segue. So I think there's you know, there's kind of two allusions here. One is that Aureliano is inspired to become a rebel when he witnesses Moscote stealing the vote, right? So, and very openly just changing the blue ballots to red ballots, or red to blue. I can't remember which color is which, but so there is this notion of the political fraud as being a reason to move to action, right? To do something, to object. And then the other thing is that train, you know, the train with the 3,000 bodies, and the idea that if government sources propaganda just insist that it didn't happen, that then that is the truth that exists for people, which I think is very relevant to our current moment, unfortunately.
Also the fact that the red and the blue party in the novel, it's questioned how different are they really? Like, and I think at one point someone says something like, the only difference between the liberals and the conservatives is that one goes to mass at 5 p.m. and the other goes to mass at 8 p.m. So I think that's a critique that in some ways could be made of our candidates as well. What else?
We haven't talked about writing in the novel and all the images of writers. Would you want to say anything about that, since the novel itself is this experiment in writing something that gets unwritten at the end?
You know, you say more about that, because
okay,
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, so Melquiades has written the parchments, and the parchments foretell, you know, the fate of the family, and as they are read, the fate of the family
Occurs.
it expires, right? Yeah. So it's as if the novel, that's how I would say it. the novel unwrites itself at the end.
Huh. Interesting. I hadn't thought of that. Kind of cool.
Well, you can use it if you want.
Yeah. I'll steal that one day.
So, but
Um,
there are also so many images of writers and writing in the novel. If we're talking about people using writing to for fake news purposes, right? That Fernanda and Arcadio, her son, have these this correspondence when he's supposedly, you know, with the Pope in Rome, and she's supposedly, you know, keeping his inheritance safe, and they're both writing from, you know, positions of considerably less powerful than they are describing themselves to be. So
yeah.
there's that, like, deceit. Writing as deceit, writing as creating the reality that you wish you inhabited, right?
Yeah, like the Amaranta Ursula writing the letters to her husband as if she were his faithful wife when she's having this torrid affair with her nephew.
Yeah.
And then refusing to open the letter that comes from her mother, we assume, right, who was put away in the convent by her mother, by Amaranta Ursula's grandmother, because she had this child out of wedlock.
Right.
That woman is very much that character, Fernanda, a parody of the Mexican, or not the Mexican, reminds me of the Mexican middle class, but the Latin American middle class. The, like, we have 15 different utensils, and like, if you are a proper young woman, you know where the fork goes and where the 12 spoons go, and all of this kind of just attention to like details so that people won't think badly of us. We have to be properly dressed and properly groomed and know all of the social courtesies, or people will somehow look down on us. What other writing? Are there letters from the girl who goes off to study piano, clavichord, to her mother? I'm trying to remember. It's often the characters who go off to Europe who write letters, right? The bookstore owner, the Catalan bookstore owner,
Right.
writes letters back at first.
Right. And then Aureliano, the general, is also writing poetry. So, and you know, there's a whole back and forth about he wants someone to burn his manuscripts, but then they don't do it, tell him he has to do it, but then he starts writing again, and then eventually he does, he destroys them all. But I was thinking that that might also be a reference to Latin American political figures who are also poets, because there are a great many of them in the history of Latin America.
Yeah.
So diplomats and revolutionaries who are also
Yeah, the world between literary figures and political leaders is fluid.
So maybe our last question for this afternoon from Susan. Buen dia means good day. Is there any more reason that he uses this as the family name? As the family name, what do you think?
Well, they had buen dias, buenos dias. They had a lot of good days, and then they didn't anymore. Maybe it's a little ironic.
Well, it's interesting too that, and I'll have to check back to make sure I'm right about this, but Jose Arcadio Buendia is called Jose Arcadio Buendia, and Aureliano, his son, is called Aureliano Buendia. But once you get down in the generations, the Buendia doesn't really come up very much. It's not that they changed their last name, it's just the last name does not identify them anymore, which is kind of interesting. And I don't know what that means. Buen dia. Yeah, because Ursula Iguaran, that's her name. And Ursula, of course, means bear, but it could also perhaps be related to the constellation. I don't know. And Iguaran, it sounds, I don't know, Anna, it sounds
Doesn't
kind of
bring up
indigenous.
anything for me.
Yeah.
No. I mean, just changing the subject slightly, but speaking of illusions and meanings of things, I thought it was really interesting that he brings in characters from other novellas, short stories. The Colonel from No One Writes to the Colonel kind of turns up. The guy with the angel wings has a whole short story devoted to him. There's like an Herendira figure.
The Herendira story of the girl who is prostituted by her grandmother because she burnt down their house by accident.
Yeah, and the funeral. He mentioned something about there was going to be a funeral for a dictator, and then he wrote a whole novel called "The Funerales de Mama Grande" about the funeral of the dictator. So it's like he stuffed everything in here from his literary life.
So Catherine and Anna, could you share just brief closing thoughts about why the novel endures?
Sure. Who should go first?
You go, Anna.
Okay. Well, I think it expands the reader's imagination. And I think I really appreciate the Black sense of humor and the way it allegorizes all these very difficult scenarios like violence, injustice, corruption, dictatorship. As I've said, that take place not just in Latin America, but all around the world. So I think it is a Latin American novel, but it's also like a world literature novel. And it depicts characters that are battered by all of these difficult emotions like love and lust and incestuous attractions. And yet it's never judgmental toward the characters. Sometimes it's very cruel to the characters, but it's never like petty or mean. There's majesty almost to the tone without being pompous at the same time, which I think is a really difficult tightrope to walk. Yeah. And then the scope, as we've discussed, is epic, like Greek mythology or the Odyssey or the Bible. And yet it's not that difficult to understand it and enjoy it. And then finally, we've just made it part of our canon, haven't we, right? So we teach it in schools, parents recommend it to their children, people give it to each other as gifts. It's become part of our American, in the sense of America, the continent, culture.
Very well said, Anna.
Thank you.
I have very little to add, but I would add it's also become a model for other works of literature that have been subsequently produced. I had mentioned two, but there are many, many more. So he's really laid out a way to do critique without like slamming you over the head with it or forcing your nose into something really repugnant, right? So, but it's there. The critique is there, and I think that's really powerful. It's it does speak across situations. It's not tied to one moment or one place, even though it has that kind of specificity to it. I think Anna's absolutely right. It speaks to these really important themes, corruption being one of them, the corruption of power, and the ways in which memory works and doesn't work So
That's a really important theme we didn't talk about much.
we didn't even talk about that. Yeah. Next time.
Or solitude and loneliness.
Well, Anna and Catherine, thank you so much for your insightful conversation today. We really appreciate it. I know this conversation could last many more hours, given the novel.
Warming up.
There you go. A big thank you to attendees, all of you, for joining us today.
Susan, I really appreciate all your contributions, Susan, whoever you are.
Yeah, I wish we could actually see you. That would be much more dynamic. But we understand, the constraints of the platform. But someday, maybe, if you're in the Oval, just wave hi and introduce yourself.
Perfect. There you go. And we hope you all can join us next month. Book club will be on December 16th. We're changing our schedule a little bit because of finals week. So we'll be discussing Moby Dick by Herman Melville next month.
Wow, that's a short read.
Yes, so you have an extra couple of weeks to prepare. But again, thank you all so much. Have a great evening, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Okay, bye.